There's nothing like good, well laid out plans. Setting all the details, organizing all the logistics, then seeing it all come together. It's so good. And yes, I am that kind of a sicko. What can I say? It's who God made me to be. My love for a good, well-organized plan really comes out when we travel, too. And back in 2017, poor Amanda got the full force of my sickness when we decided to travel to New England for the first time. We figured we'd fly to Boston, drive around Massachusetts, then New Hampshire and Maine. We thought we'd take in some of the historic sites and then drive out to Cape Cod before ultimately heading north into Maine. It was July, so it was also a good time for us to remember what 65 degrees feels like. We were so excited. Now, to those who have never traveled with me or an obsessive planner, this sounds like a nice, relaxing, even a marginally educational vacation, doesn't it? But what you don't know, and what Amanda sadly does know, is that as someone who has a degree in history, my favorite time period in American history is the American Revolution, the founding of our country. So no, this was not some nice, relaxing vacation. In my planning of every aspect of this trip, I mapped out and scheduled every single solitary stop and site on our itinerary. 2 days in Boston, not enough, but that's what we had. 2 days in Boston, the Kennedy Library, Quincy, New Bedford, Cape Cod, Plymouth, Lexington, and Concord, and tons of little stops there in between. Then we would finally head into Maine. We had it all figured out. I had it all figured out, right down to the smallest details. We were going to see everything. We were going to even have fun, too. I just needed to schedule it. But after about 3 days, which was 3 days too long, I realized that I had planned plenty of fun for me, not for Amanda. She was worn out from jumping from site to site, not to mention we were both nearly dead from climbing the Bunker Hill Monument. But in all of my planning, I had planned for myself, not my wife, who was lovingly and patiently bearing with me as I nerded out all over Boston. She enjoys history too, but not like that. This trip was beginning to unravel. My plans were getting in the way of our plans, and I realized I had focused on myself and on my fears, that I wouldn't be able to do all the stuff that I wanted to do. So I got my head on straight. And we dumped some sites from our itinerary and visited others on a shorter schedule before deciding to spend some much-needed time at an inn in Boothbay Harbor, Maine. This wasn't planned, but we decided we needed to rest for once and maybe go on a sailboat. I needed to put my plans away and give much more consideration to my wife. I'm just grateful I realized my mistake before Amanda's patience finally ran out. The Israelites, on the other hand, didn't figure it out in time, and it cost them 40 years in the wilderness. You see, God had made plans, and he even shared those plans with his chosen people. He tells them, I have come down to rescue you from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring you up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. This is everything you want. Anything you ever wanted will be there. After generations of slavery in Egypt, they would now be freed. No longer would they suffer under the desert sun. No longer would they hunger and thirst. No longer would they fear for their lives while building Pharaoh's monuments. Now they would be free to worship God, free to live as God's people, and free to inherit the land that had been promised to their ancestors, Abraham and Sarah. This was the answer to their desperate prayers. And after 10 extremely well-executed plagues, God split the Red Sea in half and led his people out of Egypt and into the Sinai desert. They were finally free from Pharaoh and free from his army. God had dramatically revealed his power and his glory in this rescue. There was no denying the truth of the Lord that day, especially as he brought the most powerful nation on the face of the planet to its knees. So it's no wonder that the Israelites couldn't help but sing and worship there on the far shores of the Red Sea. God's promises and his plans had finally come to reality. Israel's deliverance had arrived. And their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was shown to be the true Lord of heaven and earth. Can you just imagine their joy? Can you feel their joy? Think about the slaves in Galveston back in June of 1865, when they finally heard 2 years too late that the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued. After all those years, after seeing their families split apart, sold off, never to be reunited again, after the beatings and the suffering, after being treated like animals, their liberation had arrived. Their prayers had been answered. Their joy must have been indescribable. Many of us have experienced our own kinds of deliverance, haven't we? Maybe after months and months and months of chemo and radiation, after difficult surgery and reconstruction, you finally got the news you've been praying for. The scans are clear. You're cancer-free. Or maybe it was a mental illness that you had battled day after day, night after night, before finally you found the counseling and the medication that helped you see yourself and the world rightly, perhaps for the first time. That day it was like the clouds parted and you saw the sun for the first time. Then others may have been enslaved to a long-standing sin, either one that was out in the open or one that was cloaked in secrecy. You thought you'd never be free from alcohol or drugs or lust or temptation. The spiritual battle never seemed to stop. But one day, perhaps through a trusted friend or a small group here at the church, you experienced God's liberating grace for the first time. You felt the chains fall away as you stepped into the promised land of forgiveness and restoration. It was all there. What a day it must have been to experience God's plan of salvation, his rescue plan, to see it all come to fruition in your own life. There's nothing better than that. The problem for Israel, though, came sometime later. God leads them across the Sinai desert to the border of Canaan, to the border of the Promised Land. And there, after this what actually was a fairly short and direct journey, they arrived, even though the journey was more like driving the kids to grandma's house, where they complain and grumble the whole way. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? That's what the Israelites did. Despite all of that annoying complaining, God remained faithful to them and to his plans and brought the Israelites within sight of their promised home. So God tells Moses, "Go, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, one man from each of the 12 tribes. Look at the cities, the fortifications, look at the land, the crops, and the water. And if the food is good, bring back a sample of that too. See that the land is good." The men do just that. They go all over Canaan, through the cities and the farms, and even bring back a ton of grapes and pomegranates and figs. The land is lush with good food. It flows with milk and honey. This is a glorious report. It's everything God ever promised them. But as soon as they share this good news, the spies' words turn fearful. They say the people who live in Canaan are extremely strong. Plus, they're huge, giants even, and the cities have massive stone walls around them. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, they said, and we looked the same to them. It's at this point that Caleb steps forward and tries to quiet the crowd. He wants to encourage them, to remind them of God's ancient plans that they saw fulfilled in Egypt. He wants them to remember the heavenly power and glory that was poured out on their behalf. He says, we should go up and take possession of the land, for surely we can do it. After all, God is with us. We followed him this far, and things have worked out every step of the way. He's called us across this border and take possession of the land. Let's do it. But the people, as well as the other spies, lose their minds. They respond in fear. We can't do this. We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. And the land devours those who are living in it. It's a total disaster. But even more than that, I want you to see that these words stand in direct opposition, not only to the words of the faithful servant Caleb, but also against Moses and Aaron and Joshua, and ultimately against God. They renounced God's promise to accompany them with his awesome presence, to grant them decisive victory against what seemed to be overwhelming odds, and to give them their rightful inheritance as the people of God, a homeland of abundant prosperity. Instead of seeing these obstacles through the eyes of God, through his plans, instead of trusting in God's power and his faithfulness, instead of having faith the size of a mustard seed, they saw only their own weaknesses. To make matters worse, the Israelites began to cry and lament, complaining against Moses and Aaron. They even suggest that they should go back to Egypt. If only we had died in Egypt, they say, or if we had died in the wilderness, why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Basically, the people have forgotten about God and his plans, and they revolt. They're so big, we're so small, we're powerless, we're going to die. We should go back to Egypt because at least we had food and shelter there. The Egyptians beat us, but they didn't kill us. We're going to die here. Can you believe it? Can you believe this nonsense? These people who had seen firsthand the marvelous and miraculous demonstration of God's glory against one of the most powerful nations of the time now long to return to a world of bondage rather than believe a word of blessing. It's so remarkable. It's so disheartening that Moses and Aaron fall on their faces in shame and anger. And then Caleb and Joshua step forward, those two faithful spies, pleading with the people to remember God and his powerful presence. The land we passed through, they said, and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. We didn't read it, but you know what happens next? The people tried to stone Caleb and Joshua. Moses and Aaron plead with God and with Israel, but Israel will not back down. So things unravel quickly. God's patience runs out, and he says none of these people will ever enter the promised land, except for Joshua and Caleb. They are the only ones who trusted me and my plans. Now turn around and go back to the wilderness. And so begins 40 years of wandering in the desert until the next generation can be lifted up and can trust in God's plans. Israel made its own plans that ran completely contrary to God's. They let fear and self-interest guide them, rather than the creator of the universe, who not only freed them from slavery, but split the Red Sea in half. God's plans were ones of blessing and promise, true safety and security. God was offering them life. He was offering them deliverance, and all he asked for was trust. Trust in his promises, trust in his plans, that they trust in his goodness and faithfulness. But they couldn't or wouldn't do it. They let fear and distrust consume them to the point that bondage seemed more preferable than blessing. But how often are we like that? Here we are several thousand years later, and if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that far too often we are not that much different than the ancient Israelites. God has good plans for us. He offers us a future of blessings. He offers us a future in general. But when push comes to shove, we don't trust Him. Not with our lives, not with our finances, not with our decisions, not with our relationships, not with our marriage, not with our children, and certainly not with our careers or our future. On some deep level, we doubt God's faithfulness. We doubt His plans, and we prefer to do things our own way. That's why you wouldn't believe how many times I've been asked at people's funerals to have musicians play Frank Sinatra's My Way. We want to do it my way. This failure goes way beyond our daily lives, though, and extends even into our spiritual lives. We can see that in the way that we discuss sin and salvation. We Methodists on Sunday mornings say that God has called us to be holy as He is holy. We pray and we ask God to pour His Spirit out on us, filling us with His sanctifying grace so that we may be perfect in love, right? We say this every Sunday. But the whole time, we either got our fingers crossed behind our backs, thinking this will never happen to me, or we leave the church and go back to living like the rest of the world, like we never came into church to begin with. We acknowledge that the experience of salvation is good and to be desired, but we continually sound a pessimistic note to the effect that we can never totally conquer sin. Maybe I'll be perfect in heaven. Maybe someday, we say. But we sound just like the unfaithful spies. We don't trust in the power of God, and we wonder whether or not His plans for our full salvation are truly good. So instead, we need to look to Joshua and Caleb and trust alone in the power of God, armed with faith in the infinite effectiveness of the blood, which cleanses us from all unrighteousness, and boldly stand up and say, "The Lord is with us. Let us go up at once and possess the land, for we are well able to overcome. We can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. He will purify us, and He will give us freedom from sin in this life, because that is what His death has ensured and what His word has promised." And that goes for the church, too. I recently read a book called Autopsy of a Deceased Church. Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And every chapter is an example of churches that failed to follow God. They don't trust in His plans and His promises, so they returned to Egypt or died in the wilderness. Many of these churches clung to the past, to days of glory that may or may not have ever actually happened. So they refused to budge on worship styles, on worship times, or how rooms in the building were used. Their highest priority wasn't following God into the promised land of serving others. Rather, it was their own comfort and the way things had always been done. It was the past that they served, not the Lord. Other churches refused to move beyond their own preferences, the things they liked and the things that made them happy. The church, they thought, existed to serve them, not the community. But still, there were other churches who refused to accept that their community had changed, that it had gotten younger or more diverse. So they refused to reach out to those who didn't look like them or live like them. That new family that moved in next door, we'll wave to them while we take the trash out. But invite them to church? I'm not sure they'd fit in. Plus, I don't really know them that well. I don't think I'll do that. These churches wanted to go back to Egypt, but instead God sent them into the wilderness, where all they did was wander around for a few more years before ultimately closing the doors and selling the property. But we cannot be like that. We cannot be like that. As a church or as individuals, we cannot live like the 10 unfaithful spies. We cannot return to Egypt. We cannot wander in the desert for 40 years. We have only one choice, and it's to trust in God's faithfulness and His promises. It's to trust in God's good plans. Because we have seen what lengths God will go to accomplish His plans for us, even going so far as to send His Son to die and rise again for us. God has given us everything, including Himself, so that we might be free and have a future filled with blessings. Which means we have only one question to answer. Which way are we going to go? To Egypt or to Canaan? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.